I'm Peggy Rosga. I was a participant in Milwaukee's struggle for an open housing law. It was over a year's campaign. Most notable part was 200 consecutive nights of marching from August 1967 to March 1968. You saw some of the images of that struggle in the video. What I'm going to do is pick up the conclusion, that is the passage of the open housing law, in a poem called Toward an Epilogue. I am the old person. A young audience sits before me, wondering about these old times back in the day, these places to them flat lines, St. Boniface, the 15th Street Freedom House, the 16th Street Viaduct, Kosciuszko Park. The rectangle of this auditorium, oblong bodies curved into right-angled seats, anticipation arcing over this hour to the next and on to the next. Faces, mostly round, mouths, yours and mine. I take a deep breath, speak deliberately as if pumping air into a flat tire. I marched for open housing in Milwaukee. Shirley, Mary, Barb, Nibby, Junior, Curly, Lawrence, Peabody, Ed, we marched across the 16th Street Viaduct, 200 of us. At the south end of the viaduct, we met a hostile wall, 5,000 counter demonstrators. The tangents of the present recede, their square roots being factored out of abstract math and into the geometry of the picket line, the architecture of courthouse and jail cell, the calculus of rallies, marches, legislation drafted, defeated, resisted, compromised, filibustered, amended, debated, the rise of a reverberating chorus, determination, drive, energy, the elliptical pitch of lives rolling on ideals, one hand plus one hand, one arm around another's shoulders. We marched on when the city fathers were all business as usual. We marched on when some supporters said, "You need to pick a different issue." We did what we knew we had to do through all the heat, through all the rain, through all that nasty cold. When the crowds went home, we marched on till victory was won. Hey y'all, we did it. We did it. We did it. Crank up the music there, Peabody. Another generation sits here, waiting.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I first of all want to thank No Studios and Marquette for having me today. There are certainly many other more qualified, heroic individuals in the field that could be up here, so I hope to do this a sliver of justice, not only in their honor, but also honoring folks who are living under the weight of injustice and disenfranchisement. Excuse me. As Kweku said, I oversee the Homeless Outreach Services Department for Milwaukee County, and that encompasses supportive housing, homeless outreach, and all of our policy initiatives around pushing more funding into permanent housing, decriminalizing homelessness, and ending the stigmatization of those living on the street or in shelters. You know, and it is true, I do work for the government. Don't hold that against me. My philosophy is really to be in the system to try and change the system and leverage sources on the periphery, such as you know, panels like this and individuals who've talked today to work together to leverage resources. The stability of housing and its fundamental components are without a doubt the fabric of one's dignity, sense of agency, and the platform in which the tentacles of navigating the world begin. This is on our whiteboard in our office. This is what we see every day when we come in. It's a fancy way to say that everyone deserves to wake up in a safe place. That's how we operate. That's how we look at everything we do. I know Peggy is going to dive into a lot of the historical pieces of this, because that's a great context for where Milwaukee started, how fair housing is in its bones, but also how injustice is as well. I think for me what stood out in doing some research for fair housing and the fair housing marches was really looking at several things. One was that 1.90% of the suburbs in Milwaukee County had covenants prohibiting the sale of property to people of color. Up until a few years ago, there was still a sign in Tosa City Hall, you'll hear Reggie Jackson talk about it in certain circles, that referenced the restrictive zoning. It's signs they used to have up in the neighborhoods back in the 60s. You can't talk about fair housing without talking about all the efforts of Val Phillips and her initial 1962 push to try to pass an open housing ordinance that was defeated 18-1. You also can't talk about fair housing without talking about the watered down initiatives by those who really didn't want it to happen. So in 1965, Warren Knowles pushed forward a law through the state, and a little known piece of that was that exemptions were owner occupied properties with 4 or fewer units, leaving out the overwhelming majority of housing stock in the central city. 66, NAACP offices are bombed. 67, riots on the north side, 4 dead, 100 hurt, 1,740 arrested. And then August 28, 1967, the fair housing marches began. And Peggy will touch on that more on the panel. But I like to use that as a backdrop because there's a lot of good, there's a lot of push, but there's also been a lot of watered down, knee-jerk legislation pushed forward over the years that hasn't really done anything. In some ways it has forced us to regress. You also can't talk about fair housing and housing inequity in Milwaukee without deindustrialization. Between the 70s and 80s, close to 20,000 jobs were lost in a specific area of the central city between A.L. Smith, American Motor Corp, Schlitz Brewing, Continental Can, and Briggs & Stratton. Up until then, the housing equities don't look like what they do now, and it's certainly a factor into how we've landed in this spot. My area of my wheelhouse on this is homelessness. I've worked for about 11 years in the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County. I started at the guest house in Milwaukee. I used to work with some of the individuals you saw on that trailer from Faith. That initial picture that was part of this panel is the docks. Some of you are familiar, it's right off of Mount Vernon in St. Paul. It used to be a big homeless encampment in the early 2000s to about 2011. The way we look at homelessness at the county, and myself and people who work with me and our administrator will tell you that there's many different reasons somebody ends up on the street. You can have a ton of panels, a ton of conferences, a ton of studies done about it. But beyond all those complexities, trauma, and challenges that accompany homelessness, the singular most salient reason someone's on the street is because they have no place to live. And if you start looking at it on its face like that, I think you can dive into more tangible solutions in your community. And so that's what we started doing with the Housing First model. And I will get to that in a second. I did want to touch on, when we were planning this, obviously, the elephant in the room is the large encampment downtown that we've seen the last 2 years in the city of Milwaukee. This is an individual who we got into housing a few weeks ago. This is in the center, or they called it the mainland at the encampment of 6th and Clybourne, under the overpass. He had a refrigerator, generator, bed. He really made it his home. And what I like to tell folks is, while I'm not obviously a fan of huge encampments and we want everyone housed, my concern about some of the knee-jerk reactions in the community over the last several months has had me concerned that we are now stigmatizing individuals experiencing homelessness based on one large encampment. This was really a sense of community. This was a sense of home for a lot of people. Yes, there were safety issues. Yes, there were people with mental health issues. Yes, there were people with addiction issues. But I can go to any neighborhood in Milwaukee County and say the same thing, right? And so part of our role in working with the DOT is to protect the rights of those living out there, but also push hard to get them indoors and find them permanent housing. Housing First works in the sense that we've moved away from the antiquated model of housing where in the past we would require people to be sober, take care of their legal issues, shore up anything that might get in the way of their housing before they could actually get housing. So we would require 90 days of sobriety, take care of all your warrants, and we were requiring these things for guys living under bridges. And so you can imagine at some point the bubble burst and it stopped working. And so we pivoted in 2015 from that antiquated model to the Housing First model. We were a little late in the game nationally, and that is what it says. It's you house them first and you explore all those other issues after the fact. Them using or having legal issues does not affect them accessing housing. It's really putting in the context housing is a human right. I like to point out this slide because a lot of the selling point locally, we got a lot of pushback initially, was the utilization of emergency services. And so what we saw for our first 85 individuals we housed, they were using a massive amount of detox, ER stays, ambulance calls, crisis mobile, while living on the street. And we did a 12-month study before and a 12-month study after they were housing, and you can look at the difference. About $700,000 saved, 539 fewer mental health crisis services since they were housed. A lot of that's good case management, but a lot of that honestly is just simple housing and having a safe place to go in your own set of keys and that sense of dignity back. We really started looking at case studies. The hospitals became interested over the last few years in partnering with us on housing. And this individual is on the street, I think 13 years, I want to say, either 12 or 13. And he consistently utilized the emergency room mostly for non-medical reasons, shelter, anxiety, certain things like that. Not always admitted, sometimes admitted. But he had 105 emergency room visits in 90 days. And then during his first 90 days in housing, there was just one. And so I think, when we look at this with the housing, the case management, the primary care, we're looking at the fact that housing is, in its own way, healthcare in its essence. I always tell people a dream of mine is that at some point Medicaid will support rental subsidy, and that instead of some sort of anxiety medication, they'll do a prescription for supportive housing. A prescription for supportive housing, excuse me. And Medicaid they're getting there. I think folks are starting to understand. The other piece I wanted to touch on, because it was so eloquently talked about, I couldn't make it this morning, but I watched a little bit on the live stream, the criminal justice piece. So we started to see from about 2010 to about 2014, the same 20 people getting the most municipal citations in downtown Milwaukee for loitering, trespassing, public drinking. And again, not to be broad, but loitering and public drinking, you could say the same thing about Marquette or UWM students, but they're not getting the citations. I could sit on a bench on the Riverwalk for 2 hours and have police walk by and no one would mess with me. Our clients, that wasn't the case. So we started working with Judge Mosley to explore this a little bit. And what we saw was of those 85 individuals, 12 months prior to housing, 98% of them had some form of municipal citation. After housing, 9%. So the folks on the law enforcement side that initially yelled at us when we went to talk to different officers and explain this model started to recognize that it was working, not just for the dignity and humanity of the clients, but also easing the burden on law enforcement and not forcing them to give out unnecessary citations that they knew would never get paid. And I don't know, if you're living on the street, getting to your municipal court date is not high priority. We broke it down to, they really pushed us, which is good, those in law enforcement and criminal justice to break it all down. So we broke it down per municipal case. So if you can imagine, call for police service for loitering, call for public defender, district attorney, a jail booking, all for a muni case was massively expensive for folks that didn't end up showing up. And you still paid that public defender and district attorney for showing up at court. So it just became this overburdened economic engine that wasn't necessary. And so for us, that was the biggest selling point moving this forward in that context. And so before we get the panel up here, I just want to touch on one more thing. And that is, and Peggy will touch on this a little bit, but there are good things happening, which I think a lot are in relation to Housing First, in that in June of 2018, Peggy was a big part of this, and Supervisor Dimitrievich passed an ordinance in Milwaukee County that individuals receiving rental assistance, whether it's Section 8, shelter plus care, any form of housing assistance, were a protected class. So they can't be discriminated on based on their source of income. And that was a wonderfully progressive ordinance, a very tangible ordinance. You know, I think we're at the point where I'm all for the spirit of things, but we need to have concrete, tangible, result-oriented ordinances, and this was one. I think, you know, Jim Matthew, our administrator, was telling me a few weeks ago that we have voucher holders in every zip code in the county but 2 now. And a few years ago, you couldn't say that. So it was really a massive effort and a wonderful thing to happen, and I think something we can look at moving forward in the community as a model. So with that, yeah, I'll ask Lavelle and Peggy to come up. And I do want to mention before we get into Peggy and Lavelle, Jeff Stingley was an individual of lived experience who we work with, could not be here today, unfortunately. He had a last minute emergency. So it'll just be us 3 holding it down. So Lavelle Young is a proud Milwaukee native and a self-starter, founder and CEO of Young Development Group, where he is leading the redevelopment of the Milwaukee County Martin Luther King Jr. Library, passionate about economic empowerment and community wealth creation, and in 2015 was recognized as UWM's Outstanding Student Leader of the Year for his leadership roles. Peggy Rosga was recently named Wisconsin Poet Laureate. Dr. Rosga is an emeritus professor of English at the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee-Waukesha's campus. She creates poetry from her ongoing concern for social justice issues, and she volunteered to work on a 1965 voter registration campaign in rural Alabama, and as she said, was a participant in Milwaukee's marches for fair housing, and later married civil rights leader, Father James Groppe. So I think to start, just briefly, Peggy, if you want to start, and then Lavelle, just before I jump into questions, a brief synopsis of how you ended up in this work in fair housing.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I did volunteer to work on a voter registration project in rural Alabama in 1965. I was 19 years old. We worked in Bullock County, Alabama. It changed my life. I saw poverty that I hadn't known existed. I also didn't know that there was systematic systems in place that kept people from voting. That came as a shock to me. When I returned to Milwaukee with a group of Milwaukee volunteers on this project, I knew that I would be a hypocrite if I went down south to work on civil rights issues and did nothing at home. This was about the time that Father Groppe became advisor to the Milwaukee NAACP Youth Council, and the Youth Council stepped up its action campaign on a number of issues, and so some of us who had been down south joined the Youth Council. And the more I saw, the more I knew I needed to keep being involved. The Youth Council did not start working on housing by asking for a fair housing bill. Like most civil rights campaigns, the beginning was fairly modest. The request was that there be stronger enforcement of the building code. I'm going to fast forward now to a couple years ago when Matt Desmond's book Evicted came out, and I was reading about the issues of homelessness, and he wrote from a perspective of Milwaukee. I felt like this is where I came in. How is it that we're back in this same place? And decided to keep working on housing issues. And at this point, we were 50 years from the struggle for an open housing law. And so we wanted to make the 50th anniversary also be an action time. What policy could we work on? Well, the good folks at the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council had long had their eye on getting fair housing protection for people who had rent assistance, and so we identified that as the issue that we wanted to work on? And I thought, oh, this is a little thing, this will be easy. And they said, not so fast, it doesn't really work that way. But we did find a county supervisor who was willing to shepherd it through the channels. And we did meet with the Apartment Owners Association and listen to their reasons for opposing this. And while they never came to a position of saying, we will support this, they withdrew their active opposition because they felt they were listened to. And so on June 24th, 2018, happened to be the anniversary of the killing of James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman in Meridian, Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi. It passed. And that was great.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lavelle Young. I'm a real estate developer here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the county. But I kind of get away from that title because, real estate developer comes with some sort of negative connotation a lot of times. And I think, with the projects that I work on and with the way I approach real estate development, I've started to use community development and taking that approach because it's more of how do we see opportunities, instead of seeing opportunities just to build something, how do we really listen to the community members and figure out what the needs of the community and what physical spaces need to be built in the community, and now let's figure out models to build those. And so just take it, a different approach to real estate development, more community development. But how I got into this work, I've been doing my real estate development business since May of 2016, so about a little bit over 3.5 years. And, since I was maybe 16, 17 years old, I knew I wanted to be in business. I didn't come from a well-off background. My parents and grandparents struggled financially, moved around a lot as a kid myself, through a ton of different housing challenges. And so I knew at a young age that real estate was extremely important in our lives. It dictates where we sleep, where we live, where we work, where we go and have hang out. And so I knew it was extremely important, and I knew also that real estate was the foundation of a lot of wealth built into this country. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to pursue real estate, to kind of start to reverse the generational curse that not only affects my family, but just our people in general. And so that's why I jumped into real estate and using it as a tool to build wealth for not only myself, my family, but our community as well, which I'll talk about a little bit more on this panel. But definitely, Eric, why I got into real estate was just understanding that the role real estate played in the wealth disparities that we see today, and how we can use it as a tool to start building wealth moving forward.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think, before I jump into questions again, Peggy touched on a really interesting thing. What we've seen up at the encampment this year is there are a number of individuals who are newly homeless. 51% of the camp has been homeless less than 6 months, 27% has been homeless less than 3 months, 11% less than 1 month, and then 11% less than 1 week. And what that really spoke to was the bubble bursting, I think, with entrenched poverty in the city of Milwaukee. I think 2017 we saw over 14,000 evictions. And so when we talk about this and we talk about justice, it's looking at ways to be able to serve individuals who may not yet be on the street, but are experiencing being precariously housed, and pushing resources there as well. So I'll jump into some questions here. Peggy first, can you tell me how your advocacy work around the issue of fair housing intertwines with your work as a writer?
Yes, that's a question that I sometimes struggle with myself. I think that the kind of information that you gave us at the beginning of this session with charts and numbers is one way of looking at what's going on. It's an analytical method. It is numerically oriented. There are other ways to investigate reality that are more, have a different epistemology, have a different way of knowing. I think poetry, and as a poet, that is the kind of writing that I do most often, works by synthesis rather than by analysis, looking at how things are alike, and it is more qualitative than quantitative. I think the best example that I can give of how the two have worked together is again looking at one of the projects of the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches. In the housing meetings, housing subcommittee meetings that we had, Lavelle was there, people from the Fair Housing Council were there, university professors and organizers were there. And one of the topics that came up was the fact that living in inclusive neighborhoods seems to carry a negative slant. People reported who moved into Milwaukee and wanted to live in an inclusive neighborhood were told sometimes by real estate agents that there weren't any, or, oh, you don't want to live there. That negativity toward neighborhoods with multicultural, multiracial populations. And we saw it as a good, and so we asked, well, how can we present this quality of inclusive neighborhoods? Well, poetry. So we put together a poetry chapbook anthology called Where I Want to Live, Poems for Fair and Affordable Housing. And as long as we were talking about it as poems on fair and affordable housing, I could not write one. That language, that abstract kind of where I want to live, then I could. And it provides that other way of looking at things. And this is a short poem it's called Cake and Lemonade for Neighbors. Where I want to live, neighbors gather on front porches, watch their children play across multiple front yards, laugh in Spanish, Arabic, Burmese, English, talk about back in the day, share sweet and savory snacks, lend each other a cup of sugar or flour, borrow hedge trimmers, a shovel or rake, help with chores when need be, apologize when need be, offer a word of advice, not more, strum guitars and pluck banjos, make a little noise sometimes bring out a kitchen chair so everyone finds a comfortable place to sit on the unscreened, wide or narrow porch or on the stoop. Sometimes just enjoy all black, brown, white, golden, quiet together. The chapbook had poems by poets as young as 11 and poets up into their 70s. I may have been the oldest person in the book. Had black, brown, and white poets, had gay and straight poets. And the launch of the book at Woodland Pattern Book Center was the neighborhood where I want to live. We did bring together this inclusive community, and I think that's what the arts can do, is they can build the models of where we want to live.
Thanks so much, Maggie. Lavelle, you touched on it a little bit, but can you talk about how social justice is part of your lens when looking at development opportunities here in Milwaukee?
No, it's a great question. Social justice is, for me and in my field, because I focus a lot on the wealth disparities and wealth building strategies. So economic justice is where a lot of the time I kind of spend that niche. But social justice encompasses so many things, including environmental justice, including, like I said, economic justice and so forth. And so with my work and how do we use real estate as a wealth building tool, one, we need to address the concept that, or the reality that exists today, which is, you know, the 1% is owning and concentrating so much more wealth, and it's giving them, and we know this story, it's giving them so much of a extreme advantage to continue to concentrate more and more wealth. And so economic justice in real estate, and what does that look like, is giving a fair opportunity for everyday individuals and citizens to own land, but not just to own land. Land itself isn't what builds wealth. It's the use of land and how that use is utilized to build wealth. And that's the other challenges is, you know, we can talk a lot about, you know, the north side of Milwaukee and potentially allowing residents to buy and own land, but now we have to have tools and resources and capital to invest in that land and activate that land to benefit the community and the locality. And so I think in general, how I approach my work and what we're using economic justice is to identify those strategies and to see those gaps in those strategies and where those gaps are coming from. So for instance, the city of Milwaukee has a plethora of land on their books. That's a gap in the sense that, you know, a lot of that land should be accessible to residents, but not just there. What is the gap moving forward? Well, the gap from there is you can give away land and allow residents to have access to that land, but now what is the capital to bring neighborhoods and communities that are underwater, that have value, upside down values? How do we invest enough capital to activate that land and to make sure we give it a good chance of surviving in a starting point to compete and to build wealth from there? Other gaps we see outside of just the strategies of investing capital is investing in the use of the land. And what I mean by that is, one use, we're focused a lot on housing and how do we make sure housing is stabilized in neighborhoods and communities. But other uses are businesses and entrepreneurial and commercial uses, and how do we make sure we provide the adequate resources and tools to entrepreneurs who are looking to invest in their communities and their neighborhoods to activate in the use of land. And so economic justice, social justice is, for me and how I approach my work as a developer, more like I said, a community builder, is identifying those gaps in the fact that how has land been weaponized against us? We have to understand that there's a history of real estate practices used against us. We know all the stories of redlining, deed restrictions, but even the challenges we're dealing with today, where a lot of these old housing units have asbestos and other environmental and health challenges in them. And so as a community builder and using economic justice, you want to identify all of those challenges, but also provide strategies to kind of close that gap moving forward.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I certainly hope others follow your lead. Yeah. Peggy, you mentioned that the younger generation has been influenced by the marches in certain ways. Can you maybe give one or two examples of what you've seen over the years since the marches in the fair housing context?
Oh, sure. In fact, it would give me a great deal of pleasure to do that, because that's been one of the things that keep me going. The poems in 200 Nights and One Day, the book that I read from at the beginning, were a play before they were poems. The play was produced at the University of Wisconsin, Waukesha. The actors were students. There were white students involved and African American students involved. And we had talkbacks after every performance. And one of the questions the students were always asked was, did you know about this open housing marches and struggle beforehand? And the answer for both the African American students and the white students was no, we didn't know about this. The difference was that the African-American students went home and talked to their families about what they were doing in the play. And to a person, every one of them found somebody in their relation who had been involved. But the elders were not telling the students about their experiences. And so that whole history that Milwaukee should be telling itself as part of who it is was in danger of dying with those of us who were part of it. But this got that intergenerational dialogue going, and those students ended up being immensely proud of their elders who had been involved. And a terrific young organizer, Mario Hall, came to a performance of the play and said, I want this intergenerational dialogue to go on in the city of Milwaukee. And so he saw to it that the play was produced multiple times in Milwaukee. And all those students who had been part of it began to think of this history as part of their story, their family story, their city's story. A similar thing happened when a high school teacher in Milwaukee wanted to teach civil rights and wanted to get beyond Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Not to say anything negative about them, they certainly did a lot, but the civil rights story is much deeper than two individuals. And she wanted to teach Milwaukee civil rights history and could not find any materials. So the nonprofit Arts at Large connected her with me, and she developed a curriculum for her students for the semester. The outcome of their study of Milwaukee's open housing marches was an exhibit, a museum exhibit in the Arts at Large Gallery that was shown on gallery night, citywide gallery night. The high school was a school for students who have a history of difficulty in getting through school. Some of them, this was their third school. Some of them were, one of them in particular was absent 90% of the time. He got involved in this project. His attendance went up to, it totally reversed itself. He was in school 98% of the time. His grades went from D's and F's to A's and B's. So it certainly had this benefit in terms of his academic performance. At the opening, he explained what restrictive covenants were to Dr. Gregory Thornton, who was the school superintendent at the time. It was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. And the students really took ownership of the project. It happened that gallery night was at the end of their spring break, and none of the staff at large expected them to come and mount the exhibit, though they had done all of the work. Monday of spring break week, the staff comes to the building, and the students are sitting on the steps waiting for the staff to arrive. And the staff say, "What are you doing here?" And the students said, "This is our project. We'll mount it." They had, one of the exhibits was a replica of the school bus painted blue, nicknamed by the youth council back in the day as the Blue Goose. These contemporary students got a kick out of that name, so they created this Blue Goose, and they put their pictures in the windows. They wanted to be part of this history. These students who were not expected to graduate from high school, graduated from high school, went on to college. Some of them are now teachers. So it really turned them around. At one point, I was a talkback person for a performance of Clybourne Park at the Milwaukee Repertory Theater. Somehow the conversation in the talkback, some people expressed disparaging remarks about young people today. Where are they? What are they doing? And I said, I don't know what young people you know, but those that I know are awesome, and I think you should have them here for a talkback, which the theater did. And those students did a wonderful job. So it changed their academic success, it changed their career goals, it gave them a sense of purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. So Lavelle, you really sort of touched on something I'm very intrigued about, sort of the next wave of housing justice. And I really think that's where developers come into play, especially as in mid to larger size cities in the country, individuals are priced out of certain areas, particularly marginalized communities. Where do you see affordable housing development going in the next 5 years, in particularly in the context of financing? Historically, low-income housing tax credits have been the go-to to build and create supportive housing, but I think we've seen the valuation of that ebb and flow quite a bit. Do you have any thoughts on that, especially as we're still not a San Francisco or New York or even a Madison, but could be based on some of the development happening in the city in the next 5 years?
No, yeah, I think it's a great question. Low-income housing tax credits for the audience is a tax credit subsidy for that developers typically use from the federal and state governments. They sell those tax credits to large corporations who buy those tax credits, and in return, that equity or that cash that from the sale of the tax credits are invested into low-income housing, multifamily projects. Which are typically service individuals who are making anywhere from like one family individual making $35,000 or less. And so low-income housing tax credits have been a really great tool over the last 20 plus years. But the new challenge in the development industry is that as the wealth disparity continues to grow and grow very rapidly, low-income housing tax credits are becoming, I don't want to say become less effective, but there's another demographic that is growing that needs affordable housing, and which I'll talk about. But that's the kind of baseline of what low-income housing tax credits are typically utilized for. Now, the new challenge that we are starting to see in a lot of major cities is that there is a new level of affordability. What I mean by that is low-income housing tax credits typically service individuals who are making 60% county median income or less. But what about the individuals who are making anywhere between 60 to 80 or 60 to 100% county median income in Milwaukee, and how much of their living expenses are they paying towards their rent? And you will find that those individuals, that demographic who maybe have a decent job, maybe making $15 an hour, making a salary of, let's say, $45,000, they don't qualify to live in low-income housing tax credit projects, which is really the main and only affordability tool we see in a lot of projects. So they don't qualify because they just missed the threshold of being low income. But $45,000 in the city and in cities where cost of living is rising is not a lot of money. It's starting to, you're starting to squeeze now in this new area. And as we go into a new decade in 2020, you're only going to see that that individual making or spending more and more of their income to housing. And so the new challenges in development and the new policies that legislators are starting to look at is how do we service individuals who are that middle income tier, is what we call it, or that workforce housing tier, which are individuals who are making $30,000 to $60,000 a year, and they can't afford these super high-end market rate units that we see in downtowns or the east side. And so, Milwaukee is kind of this tale of two cities. We have very low income and demographics, and then we have individuals who are able to afford higher rents and market rate rents. And so a lot of those workforce housing individuals or middle income individuals are falling through the cracks, where they're missing the threshold for the low income threshold, but they aren't making enough dollars or enough income to really afford market rate units. To give you all a little bit more background about myself, my first project, I competed for a request, a RFP that the city of Milwaukee or Milwaukee Public Libraries put out for the King Drive Library redevelopment project. My company, Young Development Group, was selected to redevelop the library and add housing units above the library. One of the main reasons we were selected, outside of, we had a pretty nice design of a building, was that our model was different than our competitors. Our model was that workforce housing model. And how do we figure out how to service individuals who are falling through the cracks, who are making 45, 50 grand a year, but they don't want to spend more than 50% of their income on market rate rents. And so our model, we figured out a way to use low-income housing tax credit subsidy, but other soft dollars and other grant dollars to support housing for that demographic as well. So our project, we're building an 18,000 square foot library with 90 apartment units above the library. And using that model, we have a truly mixed income of 90 units, individuals who are making, we haven't started the project yet, started the construction. We plan to start in 2020. But the model that we're using is not only servicing low-income individuals, but also finding a way to find housing and affordability for individuals who are in jobs and are in a decent paying job, but once again, the housing prices and cost of living is rising. And so that's, as we push more and more for job creations in our neighborhoods, we have to also meet that demand of housing as well.
Let's give them a round of applause. That's a lot of information to digest. At this time, what we will do is ask you to write your questions down if you have a question. And as you kind of prepare those questions in your mind and line up, I might have a few questions for the panel myself. I'm just taking notes vigorously down. And Peggy, I just want to, again, I told you after the poem, thank you. And I wasn't just saying thank you for the poem, but thank you for those 200 days consecutively. Did you hear those days that they marched? They were during the coldest days of the year. You would have thought that they would have tried to wait where the weather was right and whatnot. And sometimes activism just doesn't wait, for the weather. It doesn't wait for everything to be convenient. So that type of dedication, not only to do it, but during those elements made it even more difficult. One of the things, Lavelle, that you just said, when people ask me how it is to live in Milwaukee, I said, well, if you really want to know how it is to live in Milwaukee, just go to North Avenue. Start at Lake Drive and go all the way down to Brookfield. Great. Tell us a little bit about that as you talk about being a developer.
Oh yeah, I think North Ave, that's a great example to use. The North Avenue corridor, starting from Lake Drive, you see so many different changes ending up all the way to Wauwatosa. And how you have so many different economic stories that are in each part of that corridor. But how it relates to development, I think with development, development is a very specialized knowledge base and skill set to have. And I think as more and more developers that look like me, that come from these neighborhoods that are challenging, giving developers and individuals in these neighborhoods this specialized skill set and training, they can utilize it to figure out creative solutions for these neighborhoods. And I think that as we start to share more of this information and allow others to break into this industry, you will see a more cohesive North Avenue than a North Avenue that has different markets and dramatically different markets and different situations, as you see starting at Lake Drive and ended up all the way on Wauwatosa, but everything in between has some challenges in itself. And so I think as we encourage more individuals to get into real estate, to understand finance, to understand how to build in their communities, and not just use the standard tools of development, but now taking that information and taking that knowledge and being solution oriented. Using creativity to solve some of these challenging issues in these neighborhoods. So yes, you'll see as we include and share this information more, we should in the coming years see a more cohesive North Avenue than a very choppy and different demographic North Avenue.
And I see we have a question in the audience. If we could raise the lights just a little bit, we want to make sure that we leave more than enough time for everyone.
Hey there. I would be interested in hearing on this from any or all of you, including our moderator. How would you respond to the statement, housing that is private or government regulated cannot be fair?
Yeah, so I mean, I think on our end, we oversee obviously a number of different voucher programs. And I think over the years, since I've been doing this, we've tried to move to models that aren't heavily regulated and structured, right? So Section 8 is a little hard to maneuver just because of the federal requirements. But the tenant-based rental assistance we use through Home Dollars, our Shelter Plus Care, we've moved the model to a fidelity scale that is completely low barrier. And so I think, you know, over the last 3, 4, 5 years, we've been able to make those specific voucher programs for formerly homeless individuals on the street much more fair. I think we still have a little ways to go. I think you bring up a good point that initially when I did this work, back starting in 2009, many of the folks we served were very skeptical. Because over the years, the model was so antiquated that oftentimes you would go in, break one rule, and be asked to leave. Our program, our department at the county, and the city has been a wonderful partner, has moved far beyond that. But we definitely have still pieces of that and ways to go on that continuum.
Peggy?
I think I need a definition for fair as you're using it. Fair, as I've used it, as it has been used historically, means that it is open to persons of all races, colors, creeds, sexual orientation, and so on. And so I would say, why not? Why? In fact, it's the law that it be fair.
I think Eric and Peggy answered that really well. But I think it's, if I were to add my 2 cents, I think it's always going to be a challenge, and I think we always have to, what I said earlier, identify those gaps and be aggressive at tackling those gaps. There are always going to be challenges in society that are considered our next frontier in civil rights, right? I mean, I would consider right now that our civil rights and the next frontier right now is just economic justice and closing that wealth disparity. But who knows in the next 50 years or 100 years from now what that new challenge is going to be. So I would, to your question, fair is relative in the sense of, you know, in today's time, there are definitely a ton of challenges, but I think given the foundation set by Father Grappi and Peggy Rugza in that time period about how do we start to close the gaps of illegal discrimination in housing and enacting the Fair Housing Act at that time closed a lot of those gaps. But now we're identifying new gaps. And like I said, I think those new gaps are aligned a lot with economic justice. And we always have to continue to identify those gaps and then always tackle them and provide new solutions to them.
Next question. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something?
Yeah, a couple of other things. I think there have been barriers to implementing that law. Some of those barriers have been imposed by people who are supposed to be enforcing the law. Some of the most lawless people I know are administrators, presidents, heads of departments, who overlook what the law demands. The 1968 Civil Rights Bill that contains a fair housing provision not only mapped out a route for individuals to redress their grievance when they are denied fair housing, but it had a provision for affirmatively furthering fair housing that was never enforced until Julian Castro was head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development and was pushing for this. And some jurisdictions did assess what their barriers to fair housing were And then we had a presidential election, and the next president came in, and he appointed a new Secretary of Housing and Urban Development who said, let's delay this for 2 years. Well, it had already been delayed for 40-some years. So what was the need for another delay? Justice delayed is justice denied. On the state level, I think we have to watch policy provisions as well. There was a state legislature, Lisa Subeck from Madison, who proposed increasing, funding housing vouchers with state money. Her bill never made it out of committee. Instead, what the legislature did was pass State Assembly Bill 771, which limited the ability of municipalities to create, implement, enforce rental inspection ordinances, created a system where inspections could be conducted only after a complaint was received so that the landlord would know that the tenant had complained and would take that out on the tenant. We don't really know very much about what happens in the state legislature. Local news doesn't cover it. National news certainly doesn't cover it. And our state legislatures are doing things that make housing unfair. And I feel a little odd talking policy when I'm the poet.
No, not at
But
all.
I think the things are not incompatible.
Powerful.
Thanks, everybody, for your thoughts and your observations. This panel's been really good. When I think back to the Fair Housing Marches, you knew what you were fighting for. You were fighting for open housing laws. You were fighting for the substandard, fighting against the substandard conditions that existed, all of that. Segregation now is worse than it's ever been, but it's a challenge, when you're working on those kinds of issues to articulate what we're fighting for anymore. And I think this panel is a really good example of that. How can we get really excited about the discriminatory nature of WHEDA's qualified allocation plan for implementing low-income housing tax credits? Like that, who's going to get behind that in March? It's a really technical, nuanced thing that we need to discuss. Same with HUD's Section 8 program. Why are all the Section 8 vouchers segregated in a small part of the city? There's really technical things about it. So I think in the marriage of talking about social justice and the arts, I'd like to think, how do we express these really technical things in a human way? And so I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on that.
I think it's a wonderful point, and I think back to the gentleman's question as well. I think a lot of us in this field, and you too, Corey, day to day, the layer of need compounds. And 1 week there's a certain crisis, so you allocate your resources there. The next week there's another one, you allocate your resources there. So you're perpetually on this hamster wheel. And I agree that we probably do need to, me included, be a little more qualitative about it. So I think, instead of talking about, the valuation of the tax credit or gap financing in construction, new construction, we've tried to pivot a little bit and look at the clients we're working with and telling their stories. Two come to mind really quick. 2 guys who were at the encampment for 3 months over the last 6 months from April to October. One was a full-time MPS school bus driver, ended up sleeping on a school bus every night because he couldn't afford rent. He was paying over 65% of his income towards rent. The second one was an individual who worked 6 days a week, over 55 hours in a factory, and was living in a tent. Stories like that, I found, even on the surface, are more impactful than some of the things Corey was alluding to. And I think for us, especially in government, we need to start improving on that. Yes, we have to do reports. Yes, we have to do analytics. Yes, we have to do cost effectiveness, but focusing on that piece as well.
As we kind of wrap all of these things together, go ahead, Lavelle.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think I will take it a little step further. I think a lot of my approaches, and there's so many different approaches that we can take. I come from I guess a creative lens, and how do we create models in the environments that we're in? So what does that mean? Think of any engineer who has they have boundaries, they have an environment that they're working in, and they're always figuring out, as an engineer, how to create something that works within that environment. Not that that environment is the best, but it's always how do we create something that works for us within the confinements and bounds that the environment that we're in. And so I take a lot of the creative approach rather than the how do we change a lot of things. I think there's a lot of, in my role specifically, I support a lot of people who are activists and want to change some of those challenges, but I think there's a ton of solutions that we're not looking at within the environment that we're in. I study a lot of other cities, and especially other Midwestern cities who have a lot of similar problems as us, especially when it comes to racism and segregation. The Midwest is probably the leader in the country when it comes to that. And so how do we figure out, as well as trying to change, how do we figure out solutions within the environment that we're in? There's a Cleveland cooperative model. I don't know if anyone has heard of that, but it's a very creative and unique model that empowers the community to own the land, the jobs, the shops, all cooperatively. And so I think that's an example of how we could study these models that are happening in other cities, especially cities that are similar to Milwaukee, and how do we create solutions within the environment that we're in, as well as still identifying those environmental things that we need to change. I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of energy we could put towards creating solutions within the environment we're in.
Okay, we're going to go to the last question.
Yeah, not so much a question, but just a comment, piggybacking on some of what's been said about our current political climate. And so much of what you all do is based on your expertise. We may not all have that, but one thing we do have is the power of our vote, power of just participating. I actually have a role here in Milwaukee to make sure we get an accurate count for the census. We need to do that. I've got literature on the table relative to that, but we have to all kind of, I think, step up to the plate and be active citizens. Thank you.
Eric, you want to give a final comment for the session? You said you want to give a final comment for the session.
Just to thank the panelists for all your work, and I think the last thing I would say, and it's been touched on a little bit, that I think our work day to day is our protest. It is our fight for justice, and I just thank all of you for being here. Thanks for letting the government guy and talk about progressive social justice issues, so thank you.
All right. We're going to take a small break and come back with our final session for the day.